Stop! Everyone, get down, now!
Almost there. I found it, it's here. What? What is that?
No! This can't be.
A homeless combat veteran unlocked his grandmother's mountain cabin that had been chained shut for 25 years. But when his loyal German shepherd Smoky frantically began tearing at the floorboards, he uncovered a buried secret that would completely shatter everything he knew about his family's past. Jax Harlan had lost his career, his home, and very nearly his mind to the echoes of war. With only his faithful dog remaining by his side, he followed a fading hand-drawn map deep into the unforgiving, freezing wilderness. What awaited them in the dark was not just an abandoned shelter, but a hidden empire. Before we begin this journey, tell us in the comments, where in the world are you watching from today? The fluorescent lights suspended above the desolate truck stop hummed with a relentless, tired electric buzz that seemed to vibrate directly into the marrow of his bones. They cast a pale, artificial glow over the scuffed linoleum floor, washing every surface in a sickly, shadowless light that only made the vast, empty expanse of the Montana highway outside feel infinitely more isolating. Outside the thick plate glass windows, the winter wind howled like a wounded animal, pushing sheer sheets of driving snow across the darkened asphalt of the parking lot. Jax Harlan sat motionless on a cracked plastic bench tucked away in a neglected corner near a row of humming vending machines, his elbows resting heavily on his knees, his scarred hands clasped tightly together as if holding on to the very last fragments of his endurance. His beard had grown uneven and wild over the past several weeks of wandering, framing a face that had aged a decade in the span of a single year. The heavy olive-green military jacket he wore, once a symbol of pride and unyielding duty, had begun to severely fray at the cuffs, the fabric worn thin by countless nights spent sleeping on concrete and frozen dirt. The digital clock mounted high above the indifferent cashier's counter flashed the time in stark red numbers. It was deep into the lonely hours of the morning, a time when the world felt entirely abandoned. Jax had not truly slept in days. Every time his exhausted eyelids fluttered shut, something fragile would inevitably snap inside the darkened theater of his mind. A phantom sound, a sudden rush of adrenaline, or the blinding, explosive flash of a desert sun erupting into a nightmare of fire and smoke. He would wake up violently, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird, his breath coming in shallow, desperate gasps. For a fleeting, disorienting second, he would forget the biting cold of Montana entirely, expecting instead to hear the frantic shouting of his squadmates and the heavy, rhythmic thud of medical evacuation helicopters circling in the burning sky above. Instead, there was only the hollow hum of the refrigeration units and the distant, lonely rumble of a diesel engine out on the interstate. Jax rubbed his calloused hands together, blowing warm breath into his cupped palms in a futile attempt to force the blood back into his numb, aching fingers. The bitter Montana winter possessed a cruel, insidious way of creeping through the thickest layers of clothing, settling deep into the joints and refusing to leave. But Jax was not entirely alone in the freezing desolation. At his feet, resting with a quiet, majestic dignity, lay a large, powerfully built German shepherd. This was Smoky. Even after the profound losses they had endured, after the endless miles of aimless walking, after the freezing nights spent huddled under highway overpasses, and after the long, agonizing weeks without a place to call home, Smoky never once abandoned his post. The dog was a creature of immense loyalty, his dark, intelligent eyes sweeping the empty diner with the calculated precision of a seasoned sentry. His tall ears twitched and swiveled at every minute shift in the room's atmosphere. When a weary long-haul trucker shuffled past, clutching a steaming cup of dark coffee, Smoky's gaze followed the man's every footstep, completely calm but fiercely protective, forever ready to stand between his master and the unpredictable dangers of the world. Jax reached down, his trembling fingers sinking deep into the dense, warm fur at the scruff of Smoky's neck. The physical contact was the only tether keeping him grounded to reality. "You just never clock out, do you, buddy?" Jax murmured, his voice a low, gravelly rasp born of silence and sorrow. Smoky immediately tilted his head upward, meeting Jax's broken gaze with an expression of profound, unshakable understanding. The German shepherd's heavy tail thumped once, softly, against the cold tile floor, a gentle rhythm that spoke volumes of comfort. Jax let out a long, ragged exhale, watching the vapor of his breath dissipate in the cool air. Smoky had been walking beside him far longer than anyone else in his fractured life. Longer than the steady job that had vanished when the panic attacks began, longer than the modest family home the bank had coldly repossessed, and infinitely longer than the fair-weather friends who had slowly, awkwardly stopped calling when his grief became too heavy for them to carry. In every way that truly mattered, this dog understood the shattered landscape of his soul better than any human being ever could. Across the dismal room, a young, tired employee in a faded uniform wiped down a sticky counter, casting a brief, sidelong glance in their direction. It was not a look of outright hostility, but rather a look of profound discomfort. It was the same weary, avoidant stare that society always reserved for those who had fallen through the cracks, the invisible ghosts who haunted the peripheries of normal life. Jax had long since grown accustomed to the heavy weight of that invisibility. You were unseen until you occupied a seat someone else desired. You were a phantom until a nervous manager politely asked you to move along before the morning rush. He shifted his weight on the unforgiving plastic bench, leaning his head back against the cold, painted cinderblock wall. Smoky instinctively shifted closer, resting his heavy, warm chin directly across Jax's worn combat boots, an anchor holding him fast against the rising tide of despair. Jax had been occupying this small corner for nearly 4 hours. The bench was painfully rigid, but it offered shelter from the lethal winds outside, and for a homeless man in the dead of winter, that was an irreplaceable luxury. Resting on the floor just inches from his leg was his faded canvas rucksack. The heavy brass zipper had completely split along the bottom seam, threatening to spill its meager contents. Everything Jax Harlan owned in the entire world was contained within that singular, battered bag. 2 spare shirts, a pair of thick woolen socks, a folding tactical knife, and one small, beautifully weathered leather pouch that he had carried for years, almost forgetting its true significance. Jax stared at the rucksack for a long, silent duration, the shadows of the past flickering across his mind, before he finally reached out and pulled the bag onto his lap. Smoky immediately lifted his head, his dark eyes locked onto Jax's hands, sensing a shift in his master's demeanor. "You remember what she left us?" Jax whispered into the quiet air, a profound sadness coloring his tone. He carefully unzipped the small inner compartment and reached deep inside. His numb fingers brushed against something remarkably cold, heavy, and solid. He slowly withdrew his hand, opening his palm under the harsh fluorescent light. Resting against his calloused skin was an antique brass key. It was unusually large and incredibly heavy, the kind of ornate, old-fashioned key that looked as though it belonged to a forgotten fortress in another century. For an eternity, Jax simply stared down at the gleaming metal. 25 years. That was how long the heavy brass object had been quietly resting in the dark confines of the leather pouch. The memory of the day he received it washed over him, completely vivid and unclouded by time. It was a quiet hospital room in the heart of the valley. The sterile, overwhelming scent of antiseptic hung heavy in the air, masking the scent of fading life. His beloved grandmother, Clara Harlan, lay fragile and pale against the stark white pillows, her silver hair catching the gentle afternoon sunlight. She had motioned for him to come closer, her frail hands trembling as she pressed the worn leather pouch into his strong, youthful grip. "There will come a day, Jax, when the world will demand more from you than you think you can possibly give," Clara had whispered, her voice weak, but her eyes burning with an intense, fierce clarity. "When that day comes, you must go to the mountain." At 22, fresh from his first deployment, full of unbreakable pride and the illusion of invincibility, Jax had merely smiled and held her hand, unable to comprehend the depth of her foresight. Now, the crushing weight of her prophecy pressed down on his shoulders. Alongside the brass key in the pouch was a carefully folded piece of thick parchment. A map, its edges yellowed and brittle with age, meticulously hand-drawn in Clara's elegant, flowing script. It depicted a rugged, towering stretch of the Bitterroot Mountains, outlining a winding, forgotten logging road that dead-ended at a small, solitary square, marked simply as the sanctuary. At the very bottom of the page, written in ink that had barely faded, were the words that now haunted his every waking moment. "If the world ever strips you of everything, my brave boy, this door will always open for you." Jax closed his eyes, the memory of Clara's gentle smile fading, violently replaced by the memory he fought so desperately to suppress. The truck stop vanished entirely. Suddenly he was not in Montana, but plunging back into the suffocating, scorching heat of a Middle Eastern desert. The air was a thick soup of dust and ozone. He was walking point on a routine patrol through a narrow, treacherous canyon, the sun beating down mercilessly on his Kevlar helmet. Smoky was walking 10 paces ahead, his nose to the baking earth, a marvel of military training and pure instinct. Without warning, Smoky had frozen. The dog did not bark, did not panic, did not make a single sound. His entire muscular body simply locked into stone, every hair along his spine stood rigid. Jax knew that silent signal instantly. "Halt! Hold the line!" Jax had roared, throwing his hand up to stop the squad behind him. But the enemy had been watching. The ambush was sprung before the echo of his voice faded. A deafening, earth-shattering blast ripped through the canyon wall just yards away. The sheer concussive force of the explosion tore the ground apart, sending a lethal wave of jagged rock, burning shrapnel and blinding dust roaring toward them. In that fraction of a second, when instinct dictated survival, Smoky did not run away. Instead, the brave German shepherd turned and lunged directly back through the blast radius, launching his entire weight directly into Jax's chest. The immense force of the dog's leap knocked Jax violently backward into a deep, rocky trench, just a heartbeat before a secondary explosive charge detonated precisely where he had been standing. The shockwave rolled over them like a physical blow, burying them in a choking avalanche of sand and debris. When Jax finally fought through the ringing in his ears and clawed his way out of the dirt, he found Smoky lying across his legs, panting heavily. A jagged piece of hot shrapnel had torn deeply into the dog's front shoulder, painting his golden fur a dark, terrifying crimson. Yet, the dog had not whimpered. He merely looked up at Jax, his eyes searching his handler's face, ensuring the man he loved was still breathing. The jarring sound of a heavy semi-truck downshifting on the highway outside ripped Jax brutally back into the present. He gasped, his chest heaving, his hands gripping the edges of the plastic bench so tightly his knuckles were bone white. Smoky was immediately there, pressing his warm, solid weight firmly against Jax's trembling thigh. The dog gave a low, rumbling sound of comfort, nudging Jax's clenched fist with his wet nose until the veteran's fingers slowly, agonizingly unfurled. "I'm here, Smoky. I'm right here." Jax breathed out, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. He looked down at the deep, faded scar that ran across the dog's front shoulder, a permanent, physical reminder of the ultimate sacrifice. If it weren't for the magnificent creature sitting patiently at his feet, Jax Harlan would be nothing more than a name carved into a marble wall. The military had honorably discharged Smoky after the injury, and when they asked Jax if he wished to permanently adopt the retired hero, it was the only decision in his life that required zero hesitation. They were bonded by blood, by fire, and by a shared survival that no civilian could ever truly fathom. Jax looked back down at the heavy brass key resting in his palm. The Bitterroot Mountains loomed in the darkness to the north, cold, forbidding, and shrouded in a terrifying winter storm. No one in his family had ever spoken of Clara's cabin. Most believed it had surrendered to the rot of the forest decades ago. It was insane to walk out into a blizzard chasing a ghost story scribbled on a piece of parchment. But as Jax looked around the bleak, soulless interior of the truck stop, he realized a horrifying truth. The world had indeed stripped him of everything. There was no job to return to. There was no home waiting to embrace him. There was only the cold, the judgment of strangers, and the terrifying expanse of his own mind. He carefully folded the map, placing it back into the leather pouch, and slipped the heavy brass key deep into his jacket pocket, pressing it against his chest like a talisman. He slowly pushed himself up from the plastic bench. His joints screamed in protest, aching from the damp cold, but he forced himself to stand tall. Smoky rose instantly, ignoring the lingering stiffness in his scarred shoulder, perfectly mirroring his master's renewed resolve. Jax slung the broken canvas rucksack over his shoulder, feeling the familiar, comforting weight of his burden. He looked down at the loyal dog who had saved his life more times than he could count. "Are you ready for one more patrol, brother?" Jax asked softly. Smoky let out a sharp, decisive huff of air, his ears standing tall, his eyes locked onto the glass doors leading out into the storm. Jax nodded, a spark of something long dead finally flickering to life in his chest. It was not courage, nor was it certainty. It was hope. Fragile, dangerous, but undeniably real. Together, the broken soldier and the hero dog pushed through the heavy doors, stepping away from the neon lights and disappearing into the freezing, howling darkness of the Montana night, walking toward a destiny hidden deep within the ice. The snow beneath Jax Harlan's worn leather combat boots did not merely fall, it was driven violently across the desolate expanse of the open highway, like millions of tiny crystalline shards propelled by a merciless, howling wind that scoured the black asphalt. The heavy glass doors of the truck stop had hissed shut behind him, instantly severing the faint artificial warmth and the low hum of civilization. In their place, an oppressive, suffocating silence descended, broken only by the fierce roar of the winter gale tearing through the sparse, skeletal trees lining the dark interstate. Jax pulled the frayed collar of his olive-green military jacket tightly around his raw neck, shivering as the bitter, sub-zero air immediately pierced through his inadequate layers, settling deep into the marrow of his aching bones. The Montana night was a vast, unforgiving ocean of freezing ink, offering no comfort and showing no mercy to those foolish or desperate enough to wander through its freezing depths. Yet, he did not walk alone. Moving with a silent, majestic grace at his right side, completely indifferent to the biting ice that coated his thick, double-layered coat, was Smoky. The large German shepherd did not require a leash. The invisible bond forged in the fires of combat and solidified through months of shared homelessness bound them together far more securely than any chain or leather strap ever could. Smoky's massive paws padded quietly against the frosted shoulder of the road, his sharp eyes continuously scanning the impenetrable darkness ahead, sweeping the frozen tree line for threats. Every few dozen paces, the loyal dog would pause, turn his head slightly, and cast a reassuring, steady look back up at Jax, a silent check-in that had become a permanent part of their shared rhythm. "I am here. We are moving forward. You are safe." That was what those dark, intelligent eyes communicated, and it was the only reason Jax kept putting one freezing, agonizing foot in front of the other. As they pressed further away from the glowing neon sign of the truck stop, the towering, jagged silhouette of the Bitterroot Mountains slowly began to materialize against the starless night sky. They loomed in the terrifying distance like a wall of broken black glass, an ancient and impenetrable fortress guarding secrets that had been buried for a quarter of a century. The sheer magnitude of the landscape made Jax feel incredibly small, a solitary, insignificant ghost wandering through a frozen wasteland. With every agonizing mile, the dull, deep ache in his right knee, a permanent, painful souvenir from a rough parachute landing during his second deployment, flared with a sharp, agonizing intensity. But the physical pain was secondary. It was the heavy, suffocating memories of how he had ended up on this frozen highway that truly threatened to pull him down into the snow. The descent into nothingness had not happened overnight. It had been a slow, excruciating erosion of his life, beginning on a bleak, gray afternoon exactly 8 months ago. The image of the sterile hospital room in Hamilton flashed violently across his mind. He had stood helplessly beside his father's bed, listening to the agonizingly slow beep of the heart monitor fade into a flat, eternal silence. His father, a proud, stubborn mechanic who had spent 50 years repairing heavy farm equipment until his hands were permanently stained with grease and his lungs filled with dust, had left behind a mountain of hidden medical debts. Jax had tried, with every ounce of his strength, to hold the line. He had taken on grueling, back-breaking labor, repairing rusted tractors in freezing barns, sweeping floors, pouring concrete until his hands bled, but the crushing, mathematical reality of the foreclosure notices could not be outworked. Then came the day the black SUV had rolled into their cracked dirt driveway. Silas Vance. The name tasted like poison on Jax's tongue. Vance was a ruthless, flawlessly tailored land developer who had been quietly buying up distressed properties across the valley like a vulture circling a dying herd. Vance had stepped out of his expensive vehicle, his polished leather shoes immaculate against the dirt, and offered a sum that was little more than an insult, just barely enough to satisfy the bank, leaving Jax with absolutely nothing. When Jax had flatly refused to surrender his family's legacy to a corporate raider, Vance had merely offered a cold, predatory smile. "The bank will take it by Friday, Mr. Harlan. I'm simply offering you the dignity of bus fare." By the end of the week, the sheriff had arrived to enforce the eviction, loading his meager belongings into a canvas rucksack, locking the door to his childhood home, and walking away into the vast, empty world with Smoky by his side had broken something fundamental inside his soul. A sudden, sharp blast of freezing wind snapped Jax back to the terrifying reality of the highway, tearing away the painful ghosts of his past. Smoky suddenly stopped dead in his tracks. The German shepherd's ears snapped forward, standing rigidly at attention, and a low, almost imperceptible rumble began to vibrate deep within the dog's broad chest. Jax instantly recognized the posture. He froze, his combat-trained senses flaring to life, his right hand instinctively reaching toward the heavy tactical folding knife clipped inside his jacket pocket. Far down the desolate stretch of black asphalt behind them, a pair of headlights had breached the darkness. The twin beams cut blindly through the swirling snow, growing larger and brighter with terrifying speed. In the dead of night, on a lonely highway, an approaching vehicle was rarely a harbinger of salvation, it was often a profound danger. Jax stepped cautiously off the narrow shoulder, moving toward the deep, snow-filled ditch, attempting to blend his dark silhouette into the tree line. Smoky moved precisely with him, positioning his muscular body squarely between Jax and the approaching machine, ready to defend his master against whatever emerged from the storm. The vehicle, a heavy, battered, dual rear-wheel pickup truck, did not roar past them as Jax had hoped. Instead, the driver hit the brakes. The heavy tires crunched loudly against the ice, grinding to a slow, deliberate halt roughly 20 yards ahead of where Jax stood concealed in the shadows. The red glow of the taillights bled fiercely onto the fresh white snow. For a long, suffocating minute, nothing happened. The engine idled with a heavy, rhythmic rumble. Jax's breathing grew shallow, his muscles coiled tight like steel springs. Then the heavy driver's side door groaned open, fighting against the fierce wind. A man stepped out onto the slick pavement. He was an older man, tall and broad-shouldered, draped in a thick weathered wool coat and a heavy trapper hat pulled low over his brow to shield his eyes from the biting snow. The man stood entirely still, making no sudden movements, his hands kept carefully visible at his sides in a universal gesture of non-aggression. He peered into the swirling darkness, searching for the shadows he had seen walking along the shoulder. "Not many men walking the Bitterroot stretch at 3 a.m, the man's voice called out. It was a deep, gravelly baritone, carrying easily over the howling wind, laced with a cautious, observant edge rather than hostility. "Unless they're running from something, or they've got absolutely nowhere else on God's green earth to be." Jax hesitated, his grip tightening on the heavy fabric of his rucksack. Years of bitter survival and societal rejection screamed at him to remain hidden, to trust no one, to fade into the trees and let the truck drive on. But the brutal cold was already seeping into his lungs, and the mountain was impossibly far away. He slowly stepped out from the shadows of the tree line, stepping into the edge of the red taillight glow. Smoky followed, his posture stiff, emitting a soft, warning growl that echoed with lethal promise. The old man looked at Jax, taking in the frayed military jacket, the exhausted, sunken eyes, and the sheer desperation etched into his freezing features. Then, the man's gaze shifted downward to the massive German shepherd. He noted the dog's perfect discipline, the thick, faded scar across the shoulder, and the way the animal flawlessly guarded the broken man beside him. A look of quiet, profound understanding crossed the old man's weathered face. "That is a hell of a fine soldier you've got there," the man said softly, nodding respectfully toward Smoky. "Military working dog?" "Retired," Jax answered, his voice a hoarse, grating rasp from the freezing air and hours of silence. "And he doesn't take kindly to surprises. Can't say I blame him." "World is full of terrible surprises," the older man replied calmly, taking a slow step backward toward the open door of his truck. "Name's Elias. I run a small lumber mill up near Darby. It's a long, freezing walk to anywhere from here, son. I'm heading north, straight up the valley. I've got room in the bed of the truck if you and your partner want to put some miles behind you. I won't ask any questions, and I won't expect any conversation." Jax stared intensely at Elias, reading the man's posture, searching for the hidden traps that life had taught him were always there. But there was only a tired, honest exhaustion in Elias's eyes. Jax looked down at Smoky. The dog had stopped growling, his sharp ears relaxing slightly as he accurately assessed the stranger's lack of malice. If Smoky trusted the man, Jax could risk it. "We're heading toward the deep ridges," Jax said cautiously, "just past the old logging turnoff." Elias gave a slow, solemn nod. "I know the turn. It's rough country up there. Climb in the back. Keep your heads down against the wind." Jax moved toward the tailgate, the frozen metal groaning loudly as he pulled it down. He hoisted his heavy rucksack into the bed of the truck, and Smoky leaped up immediately behind it, landing with a solid, heavy thud despite his injured shoulder. Jax climbed in after him, pulling the tailgate shut with a sharp metallic clatter. Elias climbed back into the cab, the truck's heavy diesel engine roaring with a surge of power as he shifted into gear. The moment the heavy truck began to accelerate down the dark highway, the true brutality of the winter wind struck them. In the open, unprotected bed of the pickup, the freezing air transformed into a physical, violent force. It whipped around them in a chaotic vortex, stealing the breath directly from Jax's lungs. He wedged himself tightly into the front corner of the truck bed, putting his back flush against the cold steel of the cab to block the worst of the slipstream. He pulled his knees tightly to his chest, wrapping his arms around his legs in a desperate bid to preserve his fading body heat. Instantly, Smoky was there. The massive German Shepherd did not seek shelter for himself. Instead, he curled his large, heavy body directly over Jax's lap and chest, wrapping himself around his master like a living, breathing blanket. The immense, radiant heat radiating from the dog's thick, double-layered coat soaked deeply into Jax's freezing torso, an anchor of absolute, unconditional love amidst the howling ice. Jax buried his frozen, numb face into the thick fur at the back of Smoky's neck, closing his eyes as the truck devoured the miles of dark, winding asphalt. As the truck climbed higher into the mountain pass, the surrounding landscape transformed into a cathedral of shadows. Towering, ancient pine trees, their massive branches heavily laden with fresh, glowing snow, blurred past the truck like an endless army of silent sentinels watching their passage. Above them, the thick, suffocating cloud cover finally began to tear apart, allowing pale, ghostly shafts of silver moonlight to spill across the deep valleys and jagged peaks. It was an incredibly harsh, entirely unforgiving terrain, yet it possessed a stark, breathtaking beauty that commanded absolute reverence. Huddled in the freezing darkness of the truck bed, Jax's thoughts inevitably drifted back to the small leather pouch safely tucked inside his jacket pocket. He thought of Clara Harlan, of her quiet, knowing smiles and the fierce, unyielding wisdom that had defined her final days. If the world ever strips you of everything, why had she sent him here? To an abandoned, rotting cabin hidden deep within an impassable mountain range. What possible salvation could exist in the frozen, dead isolation of the Bitterroot wilderness? The rational, cynical part of his mind, battered by months of profound loss and societal betrayal, whispered that he was chasing a foolish, desperate delusion. But the heavy, solid weight of the brass key resting securely against his chest felt undeniably real, pulsing with a silent, heavy promise that demanded to be answered. After what felt like an eternity suspended in the freezing dark, the truck's engine abruptly downshifted, the heavy transmission whining loudly as Elias applied the brakes. The vehicle slowed to a crawl, the tires crunching loudly over thick, packed ice as it pulled off the main highway and onto a completely unmarked, narrow gravel shoulder. The truck rolled to a complete stop, the idling engine vibrating through the frozen metal floorboards. Jax pushed himself up, his stiff, frozen joints screaming in protest, and peered over the edge of the truck bed. To their right, completely swallowed by the dense, towering forest, was a narrow, barely visible logging trail that disappeared instantly into a tunnel of dark, menacing pine trees. It was the exact coordinate Clara had marked on her fading map. Jax carefully lowered the heavy tailgate. Smoky leaped down gracefully, landing silently in the deep, fresh snow, immediately putting his nose to the frozen wind to assess their new surroundings. Jax grabbed his rucksack, slinging it over his numb, aching shoulder, and stepped down onto the icy gravel. Elias rolled down the driver's side window, a cloud of warm vapor escaping from the heated cab into the freezing night. The old man looked deeply into the impenetrable darkness of the tree line, then looked back at the broken veteran standing in the snow. "This is the end of the line, son," Elias said, his voice heavy with a profound, unspoken concern. "There's absolutely nothing up that road but dead timber, ice, and memories. You sure this is where you want to be?" Jax reached out, resting his gloved hand firmly on Smoky's broad, muscular head. The dog leaned into the touch, a solid pillar of unwavering strength. Jax looked back at the old lumberman, a faint, resolute hardness finally settling into his exhausted eyes. "It's where we have to be," Jax replied, his voice barely a whisper against the roaring wind. "Thank you, Elias, for everything." Elias gave a slow, respectful nod, understanding that some journeys could only be walked alone. God keep you both, soldier. The window rolled up, sealing the warmth away. The heavy truck slowly turned back onto the empty highway, the red glow of its taillights fading rapidly into the swirling snow until they were entirely swallowed by the unforgiving darkness. Silence, absolute and profound, immediately crashed down upon the mountain. Jax Harlan turned away from the fading road and faced the towering black wall of the forest. The frozen journey had truly begun. He reached into his pocket, his freezing fingers wrapping tightly around the cold brass key. "Come on, Smoky," Jax whispered into the terrifying void. "Let's go find the sanctuary." The narrow, forgotten logging road did not invite passage. It swallowed them entirely, dragging Jax Harlan and Smoky into a suffocating frozen labyrinth of towering black pines. Beneath the pale, fractured light of the moon, the snow lay unbroken and waist-deep in places, a pristine, treacherous ocean of white that completely masked the treacherous, uneven earth beneath. With every agonizing step Jax took, his boots broke through the icy crust, plunging deep into the freezing powder, demanding a grueling, exhausting effort just to pull his leg back out for the next stride. The bitter, sub-zero air burned his throat with every ragged inhalation, tasting of dry ice and ancient sleeping wood. The silence of the deep forest was absolute, a heavy, oppressive blanket that pressed violently against his eardrums, completely devoid of the comforting, familiar sounds of the world he had left behind. There were no distant highway rumbles, no hum of electrical lines, not even the faint, nocturnal rustle of wildlife. In this isolated, frozen purgatory, there was only the rhythmic, tortured crunch of his own footsteps and the steady, heavy panting of his loyal companion. Smoky had effortlessly taken the lead, acting as a fearless, living snowplow. The massive German shepherd drove his broad, muscular chest through the deep drifts, forging a narrow, manageable trench for his exhausted master to follow. Despite the brutal cold that formed tiny, jagged icicles along his dark muzzle, the dog's posture remained impossibly alert, his tall ears pivoting like radar dishes, constantly sweeping the dark, impenetrable tree line for any signs of hidden danger. Jax kept his exhausted eyes fixed firmly on the rhythmic sway of Smoky's thick tail, using the dog's unyielding momentum to anchor his own fading resolve. The agonizing throb in his injured knee had bloomed into a blinding, radiant fire that threatened to buckle his leg with every forward motion. Yet he pushed onward, driven by the heavy, solid weight of the brass key resting against his chest and the haunting, echoing memory of Clara Harlan's final, prophetic words. They marched relentlessly for nearly 2 hours, fighting an agonizing uphill battle against the unforgiving elevation of the Bitterroot Range. Jax's lungs burned, his muscles trembling violently from a dangerous combination of profound exhaustion and severe hypothermia. His mind, battered by the cold, began to play terrifying tricks on him. The dark, twisted branches of the pine trees morphed into the skeletal, reaching hands of the men he could not save in the desert. The howling wind whistling through the high canopy transformed into the distant, echoing screams of an ambush. He squeezed his eyes shut, shaking his head violently to dislodge the encroaching nightmares. "Focus on the dog," he commanded himself, repeating the mantra endlessly. "Focus on the dog." Just as his battered body threatened to completely surrender to the snow, the dense, claustrophobic tunnel of black trees abruptly gave way. The oppressive forest suddenly parted, revealing a massive, perfectly circular clearing carved directly into the heart of the mountain. Jax stumbled to a halt, leaning heavily against the rough, frozen bark of a massive pine tree, gasping for the thin, icy air. Smoky paused a few yards ahead, standing perfectly still as he surveyed the silent expanse. Jax slowly lifted his head, his frost-rimmed eyelashes blinking against the sudden influx of unobstructed moonlight. There, sitting in the very center of the vast, snow-swept bowl, was the sanctuary. It was entirely unlike the fragile, rotting structure his cynical mind had prepared him to find. The cabin was a monolithic, imposing fortress of dark, heavy timber and rough-hewn mountain stone. It stood 2 stories tall, completely dominating the clearing with a silent, brooding authority. The massive, interlocking logs that formed its impenetrable walls had weathered decades of brutal mountain storms, their surfaces worn smooth and silvered by time, yet remaining entirely unbroken. A massive stone chimney, built from thick, jagged river rocks, clung fiercely to the entire northern wall of the structure, promising a warmth that felt like a distant, impossible dream. But what immediately brought a chilling wave of unease crashing over Jax was not the impressive size of the cabin, but the meticulous, almost paranoid manner in which it had been sealed against the world. Every single window, on both the lower and upper floors, had been heavily boarded over. These were not hastily nailed scraps of wood. They were thick, heavy planks of solid oak, secured deep into the window frames with massive, rusted iron spikes. It looked like a building preparing for a siege, designed to withstand not just the ravages of nature, but the intrusion of mankind. Jax pushed himself away from the supporting tree, his boots dragging heavily as he crossed the final, open stretch of the clearing. Smoky flanked him closely, a low, inquisitive whine vibrating in the dog's throat. As they approached the deep, overhanging porch, the true extent of Clara's extreme fortifications became terrifyingly clear. The front entrance was a massive, solid door crafted from thick slabs of dark wood, but the door handle itself was completely obscured. Wrapped tightly around the heavy timber, crisscrossing in a complex, inescapable web of dark metal, were thick, heavy-duty maritime chains. The links were as thick as a man's wrist, rusted and pitted with age, pulled taut and secured in the center by 3 distinct, massive iron padlocks. No one had stepped foot on this porch in a quarter of a century. The snow lay undisturbed upon the wooden steps, smooth and perfect. There were no footprints, no animal tracks, no signs that any living soul even knew this fortress existed. Jax stood at the bottom of the steps, his breath pluming in thick white clouds, staring at the intimidating wall of iron and wood. It did not look abandoned. It looked fiercely, violently protected. "What were you so afraid of, Grandma?" Jax whispered into the suffocating silence, the sound of his own voice alien and small against the vastness of the mountain. Smoky bounded up the frozen wooden steps, his heavy claws clicking softly against the ice-coated boards. The German shepherd immediately pressed his dark nose against the crack at the base of the heavy door, taking a deep, long inhalation of the trapped air within. The dog did not growl, nor did his hackles rise. Instead, he simply sat down squarely beside the heavy chains, turning his dark, intelligent eyes back toward Jax, waiting with absolute, unshakable patience. Jax climbed the steps slowly, feeling the heavy, frozen wood groan beneath his boots. He stopped in front of the chained door, reaching with trembling, numb fingers into the inner pocket of his military jacket. He pulled out the heavy brass key. It felt impossibly cold against his bare skin, yet it seemed to radiate a strange, heavy energy. He stepped closer to the web of rusted chains, grabbing the first, massive iron padlock. The metal was freezing, biting painfully into his palm. He held his breath, praying to a god he hadn't spoken to in years, and slid the long, ornate shaft of the brass key into the rusted keyhole of the first lock. For a terrifying, heart-stopping second, the key refused to yield. The internal mechanism, frozen solid by decades of neglect, stubbornly held its ground. Jax gritted his teeth, applying a slow, steady, agonizing pressure. He felt the brass begin to bend infinitesimally in his grip. Then, with a loud, violent, metallic crack that echoed like a gunshot across the silent, snow-filled clearing, the internal tumblers shattered the ice. The lock gave way. The heavy iron shackle popped open. Jax pulled it free, tossing it heavily onto the wooden porch. He moved immediately to the second padlock, his hands working with a sudden, desperate urgency. This lock fought less, yielding with a dull, heavy click. He removed it, casting it aside. Finally, he gripped the third and largest padlock, the master lock binding the center of the heavy chains. He slid the brass key deep into the core, twisting it with every ounce of remaining strength he possessed. The lock groaned, protesting loudly, before completely surrendering. Jax pulled the final lock away. He grabbed the heavy, rusted maritime chains with both hands, pulling them violently away from the wooden door. The massive metal links cascaded downward in a heavy metallic waterfall, crashing loudly against the wooden porch floorboards with a deafening, chaotic clatter. The heavy door was finally completely free. Jax stood completely motionless for a long moment, staring at the dark, weathered wood. Behind this door lay the answers to a mystery he had not even known he was carrying. He reached out, wrapping his cold, calloused fingers around the heavy iron handle. He pressed his shoulder against the solid wood, throwing his entire, exhausted weight forward. The massive iron hinges, untouched for 25 years, screamed in agonizing protest, a high, piercing shriek of grinding metal. The door swung inward, retreating into the pitch-black void. A sudden powerful rush of trapped freezing air violently exhaled from the dark interior, washing over Jax like the breath of a waking ghost. It did not carry the sickening damp stench of rot or decay that usually haunted abandoned structures. Instead, the air smelled impossibly dry, carrying the heavy, nostalgic scent of old paper, dried pine needles, and undisturbed dust. Jax reached into his rucksack, pulling out his heavy-duty tactical flashlight. His thumb hit the switch, and a brilliant, blinding beam of pure white light instantly cut through the suffocating darkness of the cabin, illuminating the heavy, floating clouds of ancient dust that danced in the sudden illumination. Jax stepped slowly across the threshold. Smoky followed silently at his heel, his claws clicking softly against the solid, perfectly preserved hardwood floor. As the beam of the flashlight swept slowly across the interior, Jax felt the breath completely leave his lungs. His heart hammered violently against his ribs. The cabin was not a ruin. It was a perfectly frozen, immaculate time capsule, carefully suspended in the amber of the past. The interior was massive, dominated by towering, exposed, vaulted ceilings built from massive, polished logs. In the center of the great room, sitting precisely where it had always sat, was a massive, hand-carved dining table, surrounded by 4 sturdy chairs, all pushed perfectly into place. To the left, a large, comfortable living area was arranged carefully around the colossal stone hearth. But what made the scene so incredibly haunting, so profoundly ghostly, was the meticulous care that had been taken to preserve it. Every single piece of furniture, the long couch, the armchairs, the wooden side tables, even the bookshelves, was draped entirely in heavy, stark white canvas sheets. The shrouded shapes stood silently in the darkness like a congregation of silent, waiting phantoms. Jax walked deeper into the silent room, the beam of his flashlight trembling slightly in his grip. He approached the massive, shrouded shape of the living room couch. He reached out, his fingers gripping the corner of the heavy canvas sheet, and pulled it slowly away. The fabric sighed softly as it moved, kicking up a thick, choking cloud of dust. Beneath the protective covering, the couch was completely immaculate. The fabric, a deeply faded floral pattern from a bygone era, was completely untouched by mice, mold, or time. He moved the beam of light toward the massive stone fireplace. On the thick wooden mantel above the hearth, completely free of the white canvas, but covered in a thick layer of gray dust, sat a collection of framed photographs. Jax stepped closer, raising his gloved hand to wipe the thick layer of grime away from the glass of the largest frame. The flashlight beam illuminated the image, freezing Jax entirely in place. It was a photograph of a young, vibrant Clara Harlan, smiling warmly at the camera, and standing proudly beside her, his gap-toothed smile radiating absolute joy, was a very young Jax Harlan, holding up a small wooden carving of an eagle. Jax's throat completely tightened, a heavy, suffocating knot of pure, unadulterated emotion rising violently in his chest. He reached into his pocket, his fingers brushing against the cold brass key. She had known. Even then, all those years ago, she had prepared this sanctuary precisely for him. She had wrapped it in iron and sealed it in silence, waiting patiently for the day the world finally broke him, ensuring that when it did, he would have a place to fall. Smoky let out a soft, contented sigh, pulling Jax from his overwhelming wave of emotion. The German Shepherd had already conducted a thorough tactical sweep of the dark corners, accurately declaring the perimeter secure. The dog walked calmly over to the large, faded woven rug, resting directly in front of the cold stone fireplace, circled precisely 3 times, and collapsed heavily onto the floor, resting his massive head on his front paws with a deep, dramatic huff. Jax wiped a sudden stray tear from his freezing cheek, clearing his throat loudly in the empty silence. The crushing, lethal cold of the mountain was still seeping through the open doorway, threatening to end their journey before it truly began. "Right," Jax murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "Let's get some heat in this fortress." He walked back to the heavy front door, throwing his shoulder against the solid wood and shoving it violently shut. The heavy latch clicked perfectly into place, instantly sealing out the howling, chaotic fury of the winter storm. The cabin plunged back into a profound, suffocating darkness, save for the narrow, bright beam of the flashlight resting on the table. Jax moved to the stone hearth, stacked neatly in a heavy wrought iron cradle beside the fireplace, as if waiting patiently for his specific arrival, was an immaculate pile of dry, perfectly split cedar logs. Beneath the heavy iron grate, someone Clara had carefully laid out a precise bed of dry kindling, ancient newspapers, and pine cones. Jax knelt on the woven rug beside his resting dog. He pulled a small, waterproof matchbox from his tactical vest, striking a single match against the rough stone of the hearth. The tiny, fragile flame flared to life, casting a warm, dancing orange glow across Jax's exhausted, scarred features. He carefully touched the flame to the dry edge of the ancient newspaper. For a breathless second, nothing happened. Then the dry paper caught. The flame eagerly climbed the pine cones, snapping and popping as it quickly ignited the waiting kindling. Within minutes, a bright, roaring fire was aggressively climbing the heavy cedar logs, sending a massive, radiant wave of life-saving heat flooding into the freezing, breathless cabin. Jax pulled his heavy, soaked rucksack from his aching shoulders, letting it drop to the floor with a heavy thud. He stripped off his frozen, fraying military jacket, draping it carefully over the back of a sturdy wooden chair. He collapsed onto the heavy, faded floral couch, turning his body toward the brilliant, dancing flames. The heat slowly began to thaw the ice in his veins, soaking deeply into his aching, battered joints. The suffocating, terrifying shadows of the truck stop, the blinding, violent flashbacks of the desert, and the sheer physical agony of the frozen mountain hike slowly began to recede, chased away by the brilliant, aggressive light of the fire. Smoky shifted closer, resting his heavy, warm chin securely on Jax's boot. The dog's eyes slowly fluttered shut, his breathing steadying into a deep, rhythmic slumber. Jax Harlan leaned his heavy head back against the faded cushions, staring up at the massive shadowed beams of the ceiling. Outside, the winter storm raged violently against the thick, impenetrable logs, furious at being denied its prey. But inside the sealed sanctuary, wrapped in the warmth of his grandmother's final, magnificent gift, the broken soldier finally closed his eyes, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, Jax Harlan felt the terrifying, dangerous presence of peace. The fire roared with a primal, rhythmic intensity inside the massive stone hearth, casting long, flickering shadows that danced wildly across the vaulted timber ceilings of the cabin. The scent of burning cedar, sharp, sweet, and ancient, filled the great room, slowly purging the stagnant chill of 25 years. Jax Harlan lay back on the floral couch, his body sinking into the surprisingly firm cushions, his heavy combat boots still resting on the woven rug near the heat. For the first time since he had stepped off the transport plane in a daze of grief and adrenaline, years ago, the screaming tension in his shoulders began to infinitesimally slacken. The cabin was a fortress. The thick log walls didn't just block the wind, they seemed to absorb the very noise of the world. Beside him, Smoky was a sprawling silhouette of golden black fur, his chest rising and falling in the deep, heavy rhythm of a soldier who finally knew the perimeter was secure. The dog's occasional soft woof or the twitch of a paw suggested he was chasing ghosts of his own in the theater of his dreams. Jax watched the flames, his eyes heavy, his mind drifting in the liminal space between exhaustion and surrender. He felt a profound, heavy gratitude toward Clara. She hadn't just left him a building, she had left him a silence so deep it felt like a physical weight. But peace, for a man like Jax, was often a trap. As the heat soaked into his skin, his consciousness began to fray at the edges. The crackle of a cedar knot popping in the fire suddenly transformed. In the distorted reality of his fading mind, it wasn't wood breaking. It was the sharp, metallic snap of a distant sniper rifle. The cabin walls vanished, the warm scent of cedar was replaced by the choking, acidic stench of burning rubber and spent gunpowder. Jax was back in the valley, the sun a white-hot hammer beating against his neck. He saw the dust clouds rising from the lead Humvee. He heard the frantic, distorted squawk of the radio, voices he knew, voices of men who were currently laughing, currently breathing, currently doomed. ID left side, contact left. Jax screamed, but no sound came out. He saw the ground erupt in a geyser of black earth. He saw Smoky, younger and leaner, mid-air as he lunged toward him. The world tilted. The roar of the explosion was a physical wall hitting him, deafening, blinding, absolute. He was falling into a bottomless trench filled with the heat of 1,000 suns. Jax jerked upright with a violent, strangled gasp, his heart slamming against his ribs with such force it felt like it might fracture his sternum. His vision was a blurred smear of orange and black, his hands were shaking uncontrollably, his fingers clawing at the fabric of the couch as if trying to anchor himself to the earth. He couldn't breathe. The air felt too thick, too hot, a physical weight pressing down on his lungs. "Smoky," he choked out, his voice a raw, terrified rasp. In a heartbeat, the dog was there. Smoky hadn't just woken up, he had transitioned from deep sleep to full tactical alert in a millisecond. The German Shepherd launched himself onto the couch, pressing his massive, solid chest directly against Jax's shaking frame. He didn't bark. He didn't whine. He simply used his weight, a living, breathing anchor of reality, to pin Jax to the present. Smoky's cold nose pushed firmly into Jax's neck, and his low, vibrating rumble hummed through Jax's chest, a haptic frequency that slowly began to override the frantic rhythm of his heart. Jax buried his face in Smoky's thick neck, his fingers tangling in the fur. "I'm here. I'm here," he whispered, over and over until the desert heat faded and the smell of cedar returned. He sat there for a long time, held by the dog, until his breathing finally leveled out. The nightmare had retreated, but the adrenaline remained, a bitter, electric hum in his blood that made further sleep impossible. He stood up, his legs feeling like lead, and began to pace the room. He needed to move, he needed to touch the walls to confirm the solidity of his surroundings. He grabbed the tactical flashlight from the table, the beam cutting a clean white path through the shadows. He wandered toward the kitchen, toward the shrouded bookshelves, looking for anything to distract his mind from the lingering echoes of the blast. Smoky followed him, but his behavior had changed. The dog wasn't just following, he was lead-searching. Smoky's nose was glued to the floorboards, his ears swiveling toward the floor. He bypassed the kitchen entirely and walked back toward the massive stone hearth. He stopped precisely 3 feet from the edge of the stonework. Jax watched him, his brow furrowed. "What is it, Smoky? You smell a mouse." Smoky didn't respond with his usual casual interest. He lowered his head, his tail going rigid. He began to sniff the edge of the hardwood planks with a frantic, systematic intensity. Suddenly he lifted a heavy front paw and brought it down hard on the wood. Thump. He began to dig. His massive claws scraped violently against the polished wood, a harsh, jarring sound that echoed through the quiet cabin. He wasn't just pawing, he was trying to tear through the floor. "Hey, easy, buddy, you're going to ruin the floor," Jax said, stepping closer to pull the dog back. But Smoky ignored the command. He barked, a sharp, authoritative yelp that Jax recognized from their time in the service. It was the alert bark, the "I found something" bark. Jax froze. He knelt beside the dog, shining the flashlight beam directly onto the spot. Smoky was attacking. At first glance, it looked like every other section of the floor, long, tongue-and-groove planks of dark oak, but as Jax ran his fingers along the seams, he felt it. A microscopic gap, a line that didn't quite match the grain of the surrounding wood. He pushed his weight onto the plank. It didn't budge. He shifted his position, moving closer to the stone hearth, and pressed again. There was a faint metallic click, so soft it was almost a vibration rather than a sound. A square section of the floor, roughly 3 feet by 3 feet, shifted upward by a fraction of an inch. Jax's pulse quickened. He reached for the heavy iron poker leaning against the fireplace. He slid the flat, hooked end into the seam and pried upward. The wood groaned, the ancient hinges beneath protesting the sudden movement after decades of stillness. With a final heavy heave, the hatch swung open, falling back against the rug with a muffled thud. Beneath the floor was not dirt, and it was not a crawl space. A square shaft descended into the darkness, lined with smooth, reinforced concrete. A heavy-duty steel ladder was bolted into the wall, its rungs cold and unyielding. The air that drifted up from the hole was different. It was chilled, smelling of ozone, dry concrete, and something metallic. "Grandma, what were you building?" Jax whispered, his voice trembling, with a mix of awe and burgeoning fear. Smoky didn't wait for an invitation. The dog peered into the hole, his tail giving a single decisive wag, and then he began to descend. He didn't use the ladder, of course. He disappeared into the shadows, his heavy thud landing on a floor just 6 feet below. "Smoky, damn it!" Jax hissed, grabbing his flashlight and swinging onto the ladder. He climbed down quickly, his boots hitting a solid concrete floor. He swung the flashlight beam around, and the breath caught in his throat. This wasn't a basement, it was a professional-grade, reinforced bunker. The room was roughly 15 by 20 feet, the walls made of thick, poured concrete. Steel shelving units lined the walls, stacked with meticulously organized wooden crates, heavy plastic containers, and metal canisters. The room was a masterpiece of clandestine engineering. On the far wall, a heavy steel desk sat beneath a corkboard covered in maps and diagrams. In the center of the room stood a massive industrial-grade safe, its dial gleaming in the white light of Jax's torch. Smoky was already busy. He was trotting around the room, his nails clicking sharply on the concrete, his tail brushing against the crates. He stopped beside a towering steel shelf near the back corner, sniffing a stack of heavy wooden boxes. "Stay back, Smoky," Jax warned, sensing the instability of the old shelving. He walked toward the shelf, intent on seeing what was in the crates. But as he stepped closer, the floor beneath the unit groaned. The mountain had shifted over 25 years, and the concrete had settled unevenly. The heavy steel rack, loaded with hundreds of pounds of unknown equipment, began to tilt forward. "Smoky, move!" Jax roared. The shelf buckled, steel screamed as the bolts sheared off the wall. Jax didn't think, he lunged forward, his combat instincts taking over, but Smoky was faster. Sensing the danger to his master, the German Shepherd didn't run away. He lunged at Jax, slamming his 70-pound frame into Jax's chest with the force of a battering ram. The impact sent Jax flying backward, his head narrowly missing the concrete edge of the desk. A heartbeat later, the massive steel rack slammed into the floor exactly where Jax had been standing. The crash was cataclysmic. The sound of rending metal and shattering wood filled the small bunker, a deafening roar that seemed to shake the very foundations of the cabin above. Dust erupted into the air, a thick, choking gray cloud that swallowed the light. Jax lay on the floor, gasping, his ears ringing. "Smoky?" he coughed, waving his hand to clear the air. "Smoky." A low-pained whine answered him from beneath the edge of the fallen debris. Jax scrambled to his feet, panic surging through his veins like fire. He grabbed the flashlight, the beam cutting through the dust to reveal a terrifying sight. The end of the heavy steel rack was pinning Smoky's front leg against the concrete floor. The dog was struggling to pull free, his eyes wide with shock, his breath coming in short, pained huffs. "Hold on, buddy. Hold on." Jax grabbed the end of the steel frame, his muscles bulging, his face turning a dark purple as he strained against the massive weight. He was a strong man, but the rack was loaded with crates of lead and steel. He couldn't lift it. He looked around frantically, his eyes landing on a heavy iron pry bar resting near the desk. He grabbed it, jammed it under the steel frame, and threw his entire body weight onto the lever. The metal groaned, the rack lifted an inch, 2 inches. "Pull, Smoky, pull." With a desperate, scrambling effort, the dog yanked his paw back just as the pry bar snapped. The rack slammed back down, but Smoky was free. He crawled toward Jax, his front left leg tucked tightly against his chest, trembling violently. Jax collapsed beside him, his hands shaking as he checked the limb. "I've got you. I've got you." He ran his fingers down the leg. It wasn't crushed. The steel had caught the edge of a wooden crate first, absorbing the brunt of the force, but the paw was badly bruised and bleeding from a jagged splinter. Smoky licked Jax's hand, a soft, forgiving gesture that nearly broke the veteran's heart. Jax stripped off his undershirt, tearing it into strips with his teeth, and began to wrap the dog's paw with the practiced precision of a field medic. "You stupid, beautiful hero," Jax whispered, his forehead resting against Smoky's. "You just can't stop saving me, can you?" Smoky nudged him gently, his tail giving a weak but determined wag. As the dust finally began to settle in the light of the dropped flashlight, Jax looked around the wreckage. Several of the wooden crates had shattered upon impact, spilling their contents across the floor. Amidst the broken wood and scattered equipment, Jax saw something that made him forget to breathe. It was a large leather-bound ledger, its cover embossed with the Harlan family crest, and beside it a stack of heavy legal-grade envelopes, their seals unbroken. One of them, resting right on top, had a single name written in Clara's elegant, unmistakable hand. Jax. He reached out, his fingers brushing the cold paper. The secret Smoky had nearly died to uncover was finally within reach. Jax realized then that the cabin wasn't just a house, and the bunker wasn't just a shelter. It was a vault. And the key he carried was about to unlock a truth that would change the map of the valley forever. The air inside the concrete bunker was heavy with the smell of old paper and the fine, gray dust that still hung in the beams of Jax's flashlight. Smoky lay at his side, his bandaged paw resting gingerly on the cool floor, but his eyes remained fixed on Jax, steady and watchful. Jax reached out, his hand trembling as he picked up the thick, legal-grade envelope that had survived the crash of the steel rack. The ink was dark, the handwriting elegant and firm, the unmistakable script of Clara Harlan. He sat on the floor, leaning his back against the cold concrete wall, and carefully slid a finger under the wax seal. Inside was a letter, several pages long, written on heavy cream-colored stationery that felt like a relic from another era. As Jax began to read, the silence of the bunker seemed to deepen, the only sound the ragged rhythm of his own breathing. "My dearest Jax," the letter began, "if you are reading these words, then the world has done exactly what I feared it would. It has tried to break you, it has taken your peace and left you wandering in the dark. I built this place, and I sealed it with iron, not to hide a treasure of gold, but to protect a future that no one, not even your father, was ready to carry." Jax swallowed hard, his eyes blurring as he scanned the lines. Clara went on to explain a history he had never suspected. The Harlan family hadn't just been mechanics and ranchers, they had been the silent stewards of the Bitterroot Valley for over a century. Decades ago, when developers first began eyeing the pristine mountain passes, Clara had realized that the land would eventually be carved into pieces by men who valued profit over the soul of the earth. "I spent 30 years quietly buying back the original land grants," she wrote. "I moved every acre into a private trust, a legal fortress that cannot be breached by banks or eminent domain. This valley, from the high ridges to the Silver Creek below, does not belong to the state or the corporations. It belongs to the Harlan Trust, and as of my passing, Jax, that trust belongs solely to you." Jax dropped the letter into his lap, his head spinning. He looked around the bunker at the stacks of crates and the heavy steel safe. He scrambled over to the shattered wooden boxes that had spilled during the accident. He pulled out a thick, plastic-wrapped bundle of documents. Land deeds not for 10 acres or 50. There were hundreds. Survey maps showed a vast, contiguous empire of wilderness, ancient forests, hidden meadows, and the very ground the cabin stood upon. He saw the official seals of the Montana Land Office, the signatures of governors, and the ironclad clauses of the trust. He moved to the safe, his fingers spinning the dial to the combination Clara had hidden in a nursery rhyme she used to sing to him as a child. The heavy door groaned open with a rhythmic mechanical click. Inside were not bars of silver, but something far more powerful, the investment ledgers of the trust. Over 25 years, the funds Clara had set aside had grown into a staggering fortune, a resource intended for one singular purpose. "This wealth is not for luxury, Jax," the final page of the letter whispered. "It is a shield. I knew you would go to war. I knew you would come back with wounds that the world cannot see. I left you this valley so that you would never be truly homeless, and so that you could provide a sanctuary for those who, like you, have forgotten how to hear the silence." Jax looked down at Smoky, who gave a low, encouraging huff. The weight of the discovery was tectonic. He wasn't just a man with a cabin, he was the guardian of the last wild heart of the Bitterroot. He realized now why Silas Vance had been circling his father's house like a vulture. Vance hadn't just wanted a small ranch, he wanted the keys to the kingdom. He must have known about the missing land grants, but he didn't have the map. He didn't have the brass key. Jax felt a surge of cold, hard resolve settle into his chest, replacing the hollow ache of the truck stop. He wasn't a victim of the bank anymore. He was a Harlan. He stood up, clutching the documents to his chest, his eyes catching the light of the flashlight with a new, dangerous clarity. "We aren't just surviving anymore, Smoky," Jax said, his voice echoing with a strength he hadn't felt in years. "We're holding the line." But as he turned toward the ladder to return to the warmth of the fire, the silence above was suddenly shattered. From the cabin floorboards overhead, there came a sound that made Jax's blood turn to ice. The heavy front door, which he had bolted and chained from the inside, had just been kicked open. The sound of heavy boots crunched across the wooden floor directly above the bunker hatch. Smoky was on his feet in an instant, his hackles rising into a jagged black ridge, a lethal vibrating growl erupting from deep within his throat. The secret was out, and the war Jax thought he had left in the desert had just followed him into his grandmother's house. The sudden, violent intrusion of cold air into the cabin felt like a physical blow. The heavy front door, which Jax had meticulously bolted and chained against the mountain's fury, now groaned on its strained hinges, swinging wide to admit the pale, predatory light of a Montana dawn. Jax froze at the top of the steel ladder, his fingers gripping the cold metal rungs so tightly his knuckles threatened to split. Below him, Smoky was a coiled spring of lethal intent, his injured paw forgotten as he bared his teeth in a silent, terrifying snarl that vibrated through the very foundations of the bunker. Jax climbed the final 3 rungs with a silent, measured precision, his heart hammering a jagged rhythm against his ribs. He stepped out onto the cabin floor, the documents from the trust clutched in one hand and the heavy iron poker in the other. The cabin was no longer the warm, golden sanctuary it had been an hour ago. The fire in the hearth had collapsed into a bed of glowing, resentful embers, and the morning light filtered through the open door in a cold, gray fog. Standing in the center of the room, looking entirely out of place amidst the ancient timber and dust-covered sheets, was a man who embodied the very world Jax had tried to escape. Silas Vance did not look like a man who had just spent a night battling a blizzard. He stood with a practiced, arrogant grace, draped in a tailored charcoal-colored overcoat that probably cost more than the truck Jax had sold for scrap months ago. His leather gloves were immaculate, his silver hair perfectly styled, and his eyes, cold, sharp, and devoid of any human warmth, swept the room with the calculated efficiency of a wolf surveying a sheepfold. Behind him, 2 large, silent men in tactical gear stood like shadows in the doorway, their presence an unspoken threat that chilled Jax more than the mountain wind. "I must admit, Jax, you certainly made us work for this," Silas said, his voice a smooth, cultured baritone that carried the sickening weight of unearned authority. He didn't look at the iron poker in Jax's hand, he looked only at the thick legal-grade folder tucked under Jax's arm. "Most men in your position would have simply taken the bus ticket and disappeared into the bottle. But you Harlans, you've always possessed a certain, shall we say, inconvenient tenacity." Jax shifted his weight, his injured knee screaming in protest, but he didn't give an inch. Smoky limped to his side, his hackles raised in a jagged black ridge, a low, tectonic growl erupting from his chest that made the 2 men in the doorway shift their weight uneasily. "You're trespassing, Vance," Jax said, his voice low and dangerous, a sound forged in the silence of foxholes and the grit of the desert. "This is private property. My property. You have exactly 10 seconds to turn around and walk back to whatever hole you crawled out of before the dog stops being polite." Silas Vance let out a short, dry chuckle that held no humor. He took a slow, deliberate step forward, his polished shoes clicking sharply against the hardwood floor. "Property is a fluid concept, Jax, especially for a man with a dishonorable discharge on his horizon and a bank account that currently sits at 0. You're a squatter in a ruin, a ghost in a graveyard. The state sees this land as abandoned timber. My investors see it as the future of the Western tourism industry. You're just a clerical error I'm here to correct." He reached into the inner pocket of his coat and withdrew a crisp, white envelope. "I'm a reasonable man, despite what your father might have told you. I'm prepared to offer you $500,000, cash, right now. You sign the quitclaim deed, you take your dog and you leave. You can buy yourself a nice little house in the valley, get the medical help you clearly need for those episodes, and we can all forget this ever happened." Jax looked down at the envelope, then back at the man who had spent months dismantling his family's dignity. The anger that rose in his chest wasn't hot. It was cold, crystalline, and absolute. It was the same clarity he felt when a mission went south and the only way out was through. He thought of the letter in the bunker. He thought of Clara's handwritten prophecy. If the world ever strips you of everything, this door will always open. "You're not here for the timber, Silas," Jax said, his voice gaining a terrifying, quiet strength. "And you're not here for the tourism. You've been trying to find this cabin for 25 years because you knew my grandmother had moved the original land grants. You knew she had buried the keys to the entire valley somewhere no corporate lawyer could reach. You've been bullying my father for decades because you were afraid of a dead woman's foresight." Vance's smile faltered, a flicker of genuine irritation crossing his face like a shadow. Eleanor Harlan was a senile old woman playing with maps. She didn't have the resources to fight a firm like mine. Whatever trust you think you've found down in that hole is a relic. It's unrecorded, unverified, and completely unenforceable in a modern court of law. Is that so? Jax took a step closer, the documents from the folder visible now. He didn't show the maps, he showed the page with the official, embossed seal of the United States Department of the Interior, dated 1942. My grandmother didn't just buy land, Silas. She invoked the Federal Land Stewardship Act of 1934. She registered this entire valley as a protected habitat and veterans' easement. It's not just a trust, it's a sovereign designation. It means that as long as a Harlan heir is standing on this dirt, this land cannot be sold, seized, or developed for private profit. Not by you, not by the bank, and not by the state. The silence that followed was absolute. The wind outside seemed to hold its breath. Silas Vance stared at the document, his face draining of color, the mask of the sophisticated developer finally slipping to reveal the panicked predator beneath. He looked at the two men in the doorway, a silent command passing between them. The men took a step forward, their hands moving toward their belts. Smoky didn't wait. The German shepherd didn't bark. He simply launched himself forward 2 paces. His massive body a blur of golden black fur, his teeth bared in a snarl that sounded like a saw cutting through bone. He stopped exactly 6 inches from Silas Vance's throat, his muscles vibrating with a lethal suppressed energy. The 2 men in the doorway froze, their eyes wide as they realized the dog wasn't a pet. He was a weapon of war who didn't care about their tactical gear or their legal threats. "Easy, Smoky," Jax said, his voice a calm, chilling command. The dog didn't move an inch, his eyes locked onto Vance's jugular. Jax looked directly at the developer, his gaze as hard as the mountain stone. "You think you're the first wolf I've had to stare down, Silas? I've been through ambushes that make your corporate takeovers look like a Sunday school picnic. You came here thinking you were dealing with a broken man. You forgot that some things only get stronger when they break." Vance was trembling now, the cold of the mountain finally penetrating his expensive coat. "You're making a mistake, Harlan. You can't hold this valley alone. You have no resources, no allies." "I'm not alone," Jax said, his voice echoing with a profound, sudden realization. He looked around the cabin, at the photos of Clara, at the strong, silent logs that had stood for a century. "My grandmother knew exactly what she was doing. She didn't leave me money. She left me a mission, and as for allies, the valley has a way of looking after its own." Jax pointed the iron poker toward the open door. "Get out of my house. If I ever see your shadow on this road again, I won't call the sheriff. I'll consider it a direct threat to the trust's security. And Smoky here has a very long memory." Silas Vance backed away, his dignified composure completely shattered. He stumbled over the threshold, his boots slipping on the frozen porch boards. The 2 men in the doorway retreated with him, their eyes never leaving the snarling German shepherd who stood like a sentinel of justice in the freezing mist. They scrambled down the steps, their black SUV idling in the clearing like a mechanical stain on the pristine snow. Jax stood in the doorway, watching as the vehicle spun its tires, struggling to find traction in the deep powder before finally roaring away down the narrow logging road. He stayed there until the sound of the engine was swallowed by the forest, until the only sound left was the whisper of the pines and the steady, rhythmic breathing of his dog. He looked down at Smoky, who sat beside him, his tail giving a single, tired thump against the floor. Jax knelt, his hand trembling as he ran it over the dog's head, pulling him close. "We did it, buddy. We held the line." But as he looked out at the vast, snowy expanse of the Bitterroot Valley, Jax realized that the battle for the sanctuary was only just beginning. The wolf had been driven from the door, but the winter was far from over. He reached into his pocket, his fingers wrapping around the cold brass key. He didn't feel like a homeless veteran anymore, he felt like a guardian. And for the first time in his life, Jax Harlan knew exactly what he was fighting for. The brutal, crystalline grip of the Montana winter eventually surrendered to the persistent golden warmth of a late mountain spring. The thick, suffocating sheets of ice that had once paralyzed the Bitterroot Valley began to fracture and dissolve, sending millions of gallons of pure, frigid meltwater rushing down the jagged rocky slopes to feed the silver creeks below. The once silent forest was now alive, with a chaotic, beautiful symphony of life, the rhythmic drumming of woodpeckers against ancient cedar bark, the soft rustle of new green needles stretching toward the sun, and the distant melodic roar of the Bitterroot River reclaiming its power. Jax Harlan stood on the heavy timber porch of the sanctuary, his hands resting lightly on the smooth wooden railing that he had spent the last few weeks meticulously sanding and oiling. He breathed in the air, no longer sharp with the bite of frost, but heavy with the scent of damp earth, blooming wildflowers, and the sweet, resinous promise of the waking pines. Beside him, Smoky sat with a quiet, regal dignity, his dark eyes surveying the clearing with the calm satisfaction of a veteran who knew his territory was finally at peace. The German shepherd's injured paw had healed into a thick, toughened pad that showed no trace of a limp, and his coat, once dull from the malnutrition of the streets, now gleamed with a healthy, vibrant luster in the afternoon light. Jax looked out across the clearing where, just months ago, he had stood in the freezing dark, clutching a brass key and a desperate hope. The landscape had been utterly transformed. Tucked subtly among the towering trees were 4 small, expertly crafted cabins, their dark log walls and stone foundations mirroring the architecture of the main house. These were not the sprawling, glass-fronted vacation mansions that Silas Vance had envisioned for his wealthy clients. They were simple, sturdy, and honest shelters designed to offer a different kind of luxury, the luxury of silence, of safety, and of time. Thin wisps of gray smoke drifted lazily from the stone chimneys of 2 of the cabins, signaling that the first residents of the Harlan Trust had already begun their journey toward healing. They were men and women Jax recognized immediately, not by their faces, but by the specific, heavy stillness in their shoulders, and the way their eyes constantly scanned the horizon for shadows that no longer existed. They were veterans who, like Jax, had returned from the noise of war, only to find that the world they fought for had become too loud to endure. Jax stepped down from the porch, his boots crunching on the soft, pine-needle-covered earth, and began a slow walk toward the lower meadow. Smoky flanked him perfectly, his tail giving a single, contented wag as they passed the small greenhouse where Elias, the old lumberman who had given them a ride on that fateful night, was currently showing a young former medic how to prepare the soil for a summer garden. Elias had become a permanent fixture at the sanctuary, his deep, gravelly voice and decades of mountain wisdom providing a steadying anchor for the younger veterans who were struggling to find their footing in a civilian world. He looked up from his work, tipping his weathered cap toward Jax with a look of profound, silent respect. There were no longer any black SUVs lurking in the shadows of the tree line, and the legal threats from Silas Vance had withered away like dead leaves under the relentless scrutiny of the federal land documents Jax had unearthed in the bunker. The valley was no longer a target for development, it was a fortress of restoration. As Jax reached the center of the meadow where a small mountain stream bubbled over smooth river stones, he paused and sat on a large, sun-warmed boulder. Smoky immediately settled at his feet, resting his heavy head on Jax's knee, a physical connection that remained the most important thing in Jax's world. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the small leather pouch, feeling the weight of the brass key one last time before he tucked it away for the next generation. His mind drifted back to the nights at the truck stop, to the freezing cold, and to the hollow, terrifying feeling of being entirely disposable. He realized then that the greatest trick the world had ever played on him was making him believe that his value was tied to his utility, his bank account, or his status. Clara Harlan had known the truth. She had known that real wealth was the ability to protect the vulnerable, to preserve the wild places of the soul, and to hold the door open for those who had forgotten how to walk through it. Jax looked down at Smoky and felt a profound, overwhelming surge of love for the animal that had quite literally dragged him back from the edge of the abyss. The dog had not cared about the millions of dollars hidden in the bunker or the vast acreage of the trust. He had cared only about the man standing beside him. Smoky had seen the hero in Jax even when Jax could only see the ghost. That was the real miracle of the Bitterroot. It wasn't the land itself, but the way the land allowed a man to finally see himself through the eyes of his most loyal companion. The valley was a mirror, reflecting back the strength, the resilience, and the quiet dignity that war and poverty had tried so hard to erase. Jax realized that his grandmother hadn't just left him a legacy of property, she had left him a legacy of purpose. He was no longer a soldier without a war, he was a guardian with a mission. The sun began to dip behind the jagged western peaks, casting long, purple shadows across the meadow and turning the stream into a ribbon of liquid gold. Jax stood up, feeling a strange, wonderful lightness in his chest that had been absent for nearly a decade. He wasn't cured, the memories would always be there, and the nightmares would still occasionally visit the corners of his mind. But he was no longer afraid of the dark. He had a home, he had a pack, and he had a future that was written in the soil of the mountain. He turned back toward the main cabin, where the lights were beginning to flicker on in the windows, casting a warm, inviting glow through the trees. It looked like a lighthouse, a beacon for all the lost souls still wandering the highways and the truck stops of the world, waiting for someone to tell them that the march was over. As he walked back up the trail, Jax thought about the millions of people out there who were carrying their own hidden burdens, fighting their own invisible wars, and searching for their own version of a brass key. He knew that not everyone had a mountain cabin or a secret bunker, but he also knew that everyone had the capacity to find a sanctuary if they had the courage to keep walking and the humility to listen to those who loved them. Life has a way of breaking us all down to the foundations, he thought. But it is only when the walls are gone that we can truly see the sky. He reached the porch and paused, looking out one last time at the darkening valley. The silence was no longer oppressive, it was a song. If this story touched your heart, or reminded you of the incredible unyielding power of a dog's loyalty, I would like to ask you for one small thing today. Drop a 1 in the comments if you believe that every person deserves a second chance to find their sanctuary, or drop a 0 if you think that Jax would have been lost forever if Smoky hadn't been there to dig beneath the floorboards. Your stories and your voices are what make this community so special, and we read every single word you share with us. Where in the world are you watching this from today? We have people joining us from every corner of the globe, and it is a beautiful reminder that no matter how far apart we are all connected by the stories of courage and the bonds of love that define our lives. Please take a moment to subscribe to the channel and turn on that notification bell, because the journey is far from over. We have so many more stories of heroic dogs and the veterans they saved waiting for you, and we don't want you to miss a single moment of the inspiration. Remember, no matter how cold the night feels or how deep the snow becomes, there is always a key, there is always a map, and there is always a loyal friend waiting to help you find your way back to the light. Thank you for being a part of the Hero Veteran Dogs family. We will see you in the very next story, right here, where the heroes never walk alone.